To be honest, I was actually looking forward to Diablo 4, despite Blizzard's recent past. I mean, the games as a service hack and slash with more MMO elements, that sounds good to me. Yes, the store sucks Jabba's ass, and $70 is a high price, the 80 for console players even more, but I already had several hundred hours of fun with games like Lost Ark and Diablo 3, so why not also with a Diablo 4? See, Diablo 4's hype was big, the full release went surprisingly well and the overall tone seems to be pretty positive. It was also probably one of the biggest games that players waited for in this year, got high 80 to low 90 metascores at release, and is already the fastest selling game from Blizzard, that is the developer of the game and which is part of the Activision Blizzard video game conglomerate, and why I'm highlighting that you will learn in the part where I address the game's monetization. But yeah, until we get there, let's just take a look at the core game itself and I will tell you all the little nasty reasons why I think Diablo 4 is first and foremost one thing: overrated. And as always, we will start with the story, and don't you worry, there won't be any specific spoilers to the things that happen in the game and that aren't already revealed within the first hour or so. Overall, Diablo 4's story is okay-ish. By far nothing special, but it carries you quite well through the main leveling phase of the game and offers a few highlights at the beginning and towards its end. The middle of the story drags on a bit though, which is also due to the rather long distances between the quest areas and some quite unnecessary filler plot. Fix the crystal. Otherwise, it's mostly Lilith was seen here and there, then we travel to the location, have to do something for someone to get more infos about what she is doing there. Then we usually come too late to the party and are eventually sent off to the next location. Depending on how much side stuff you want to do, you can finish the story of the game after about, I think, 15 hours, or you can spend probably 70 to 90 hours in the game before you get to see the end cinematic. Generally though, I would recommend sticking to the story. Some things are a bit underexplained, and if you have to work and do several hours of side quests in between, then it can easily be that you just don't know what happened the last time that you made some progress in the main story. The current plot mostly establishes a narrative and builds up some background information. I say current because the payoff at the end is very marginal and leaves many questions unanswered, which is why the story in the current core game feels to me like the first part of something like a movie anthology. Almost if that was done in order to be able to sell the expansions later on more easily. Nah, they wouldn't do that, would they? And yeah, for me this just doesn't feel right. I clearly prefer a finished story instead of a "the first step has been made, now the real journey begins" type of ending. And the great thing in retrospective is that Laura even already spoils some future developments when he talks in Kyovashad about the prophecies that he knows.
There was a prophecy, yes. It foretold the rise of the primevals, the return of Lilith and Inarius, the doom of our world.
And well, with that, let's go to the characters, and that's another mixed bag for me. Some of them are very well written personalities that even get some character development, and because each of them has been given good to very good voice actors, Blizzard managed to make them feel alive. Unfortunately though, Blizzard sabotaged some of these performances with their type of cutscenes. Because besides the fantastic looking cinematics in the game, of which there are exactly 3, including the opening cinematic that we already know from the trailer, there are 2 types of cutscenes. The first type is the more intricate one, which consists mainly of high resolution in-game renders, and those move closer into the scenes, zooming in on faces and showing emotions. Certainly cinematics were dropped here to save some money, but that's still okay in these scenes. Even if you do notice the qualitative and quantitative difference compared to the predecessor, which rewarded you at the end of each act with one of these cinematics. Here a little comparison. And don't you worry, there's nothing really important happening here.
Lilith has entered the ancient city. With your blessing, I can pursue her.
Your kind are weak, and this world has been wasted on the crusades of the unworthy.
I can stop her.
This audience is concluded. but his work is not over.
What would you know about sacrifice?
Tyrael, the ancient law of the high heavens strictly forbids us from interfering with the mortal world. Yet you have done so, brazenly.
All I am guilty of, Imperius, is bringing justice, while you hide, cowering behind your throne.
Silence! You will now answer for your transgressions.
And on the other side, there are also cutscenes in the game in which almost nothing changes, and we remain in our top-down perspective despite the great performance of the voice actors. Unfortunately, these are by far the majority in the game, and even in very emotional and important scenes, which robs them of all potential gravitas. And here I can only say the tea drinking scene. And yet this is just a shame, and especially from a $70 Blizzard game, I would have expected much more here. But aside from the good characters, there was also the opposite. Let's start here with Neyrelle, the obligatory, overmotivated student character who is just annoying and likes to decide things over our heads until the end, causing you and me as players, as so often with these kind of characters, just problems, so that it's easy for the writers to create new plotlines. But hey, somehow you have to construct cliffhangers for the expansions, don't you? And yeah, that she's also then used as a plot device and exposition dump towards the end to explain what happened and what the game revealed to you over the past minutes, so even the most brain-dead players could understand the last part of this game's story, doesn't really help here. And it kind of feels like that's exactly what Blizzard expects their player base to be. People that are happy because they understood the story of a Transformers movie. It's fine that these kinds of stories exist, don't get me wrong, but it certainly could have been much better, and that's just disappointing. But don't you worry again, it's far from just Neyrelle. Even the most important characters seem incredibly flat compared to their relevance in Sanctuary and presence in its lore. Inarius, for example, is introduced at the beginning of the game as a self-centered asshole.
But they never mention how being tortured in hell for a few millennia turned you into an ass.
And really just remains, until the end, an internally broken religious leader with a main character complex. And then there's Lilith, poster girl and main antagonist of the game. Doesn't really get any depth at any point either. It's frequently touched upon and you're permanently waiting to learn more about her story and true inner motivation, maybe even her emotions. But Blizzard fails to deliver here, because you mostly just run after her the whole time and only ever get to the locations when most things were already over anyway to take care of the remains. In general, the story of the game consists of a lot of tell, but very little show. Also, just how important these two are, in my opinion, is neither sufficiently emphasized on, nor do they get appropriate screen time or plot with each other. And that's despite the fact that there is so much potential here. After all, we are literally talking about the mother and father of Sanctuary and the humans itself. And what does the game do with them? Well, those who know previous Diablo games probably can guess what happens. It's actually disappointing that some of the characters in this game are the most interesting as long as the game does virtually nothing with them. Because all the time you're wondering what might be coming, and then there's nothing. Except for a cinematic in the last act of the game that tries to get Lilith and Inarius to act out their relationship within 5 minutes of screen time. Guess how well that worked. And speaking of the final act, that one is in general an embarrassment in terms of writing and feels incredibly rushed to me. Our character automatically makes decisions that I personally can't relate to or would have made myself, which leaves a kind of bitter taste in my mouth that way. And then several important characters are just killed off, even though up until then it seems like it's just the beginning of a much larger story around them and a character development. One character death in particular was so stupid, out of character and cheap that I came close to get angry at the game. You could literally taste there that this was only done because they just didn't know what to do with that character anymore. It's really hard to go into details here without spoiling anything, but those who have played it will absolutely know what scene I mean. And that one was just pathetic. And I mean, hell, even the lesser evils that appear alongside Lilith literally only ever have a single fight with us and are of no further relevance. Again, I can only draw the comparison to Diablo 3's lesser evils, Belial and Asmodean, whose part in the story was so much more important. But for Duriel and Andariel, if their names hadn't been written on their life bars, I would have hardly recognized them as quasi-generals of hell. Especially not Duriel, who just seemed like a random boss encounter to me. And the same goes for Astaroth. Poof, there he was, 2 minutes of fighting, poof, and he's gone again. The fuck? I mean, it may sound arrogant, but I'm relatively sure that even I, as a hobby world builder, could have pulled a better story outline out of my ass in an hour than the one of Diablo 4. Another thing that I've noticed when I played Diablo 3 again for comparison was, what the fuck is wrong with our character in Diablo 4? We get no class backstory and everyone says the exact same thing in the exact same tone with absolutely zero own personality. I mean, that's not a crazy big thing, but what's the point of having pre-made archetypes in this game if they're just empty shells? Then you might as well give players the option to freely create their own nameless hero, or not. And the worst thing is, if you look at the Rogue cinematic from BlizzCon 2021, it seems like they originally wanted to do much more here. Possibly even class-specific quest lines and such things. But it looks like that idea was thrown away at some point, maybe to get Diablo 4 faster out the door after the backlash they got for Immortals. I don't know.
I am a thief, a heretic, a murderer, father.
And speaking of Diablo 3 again, has anyone seen Tyrael? Was he on vacation or did they save him up for the expansions? I mean, yeah, sure, one day he disappeared. Sure, whatever. But it's hard for me to believe that he would keep his legs still when suddenly the demon mother of Sanctuary itself walks on Earth again. So that was also kind of strange and seemed very out of character to me. All in all, I have to say that Diablo 4's story is many things, but certainly not one of a $70 AAA game, no matter how interesting the lore is and how great the voice actors perform. If I were a pure story player, I would have been very disappointed after that ending, and I can't get over the feeling that we are drip-fed here. So Blizz can charge us for every little batch of new, meaningful story content, because, well, I doubt that the first expansion will end particularly differently than this core game's story. So let's move on to the presentation of the game. And here we just have to admit, Diablo 4 looks really good, and is probably the first RPG to get on the same visual level as Warzone. At least if you play it on at least high settings. Because if you don't, you will suddenly see more muddy textures than the 5 to 6 GB VRAM usage on medium textures would suggest. Which then also has additional negative effects on things like the tessellation and sometimes massively drags down the visual details. In general, it is sometimes difficult to know what effects graphic settings have, and I really would have liked to see some preview images in the graphic settings, as they are nowadays common in, for example, Ubisoft games. But if you play with at least high settings, you get a game with good looking characters, pretty environments, lots of details and gorgeous backgrounds and undergrounds. Even if they don't do anything new with the 5 biomes of the base game, and you might also call them rather generic, what is understandable, the designers managed to bring each of them to life as well as they could in a world overrun by demons. The icy cold of the fractured peaks, the grassy mountain landscapes of Skosglen, or the depressing interiors of the dungeons and caves, each area was lovingly designed and has its own character. I basically enjoyed exploring the map and also stopped occasionally just to admire my surroundings. And that is something that not many games are able to make me do. What always threw me off though were individual objects and cutscenes that had far worse textures than all the objects around them. Since these were also the things we interacted with and were therefore in focus, I really don't understand why they left it that way. In general, the texture quality is, even on high texture settings, very mixed, so you can often see muddy textures side by side with detailed ones. What often gave me the feeling of an unpolished product whenever I noticed that. What didn't felt unpolished whatsoever are the sound and music of Diablo 4. Those are in short fantastic. The mostly orchestral pieces are very solid and often lay the emotional fundament for scenes. I'm not a music connoisseur myself who listens to game soundtracks every day, but even I was positively surprised by some of the pieces, which does indeed speak for the production quality. And for the sound, I was thinking about whether I should include it here or not, because in a game like Diablo, sound is almost more part of the gameplay, because that stands and falls depending on how it feels and sounds. And in Diablo 4 you get both sound and the animations on an absolute top level. There were moments when I probably would have stopped playing the game if the monster slaying itself haven't felt so awesome. The sound of steel, guts splattering to the ground from exploding monsters, the grunts and screeches of our enemies. Diablo 4 doesn't have the explosiveness of a Lost Ark, but if someone asked me what I wanted combat to look like in a more down-to-earth kind of ARPG, then that would be what Diablo 4 is doing here. That is just fantastic, and they absolutely nailed that part of the game. And then there is the general style of Diablo 4. Unlike Diablo 3, it goes back to dark and gritty, which is what many players wanted. And also, I prefer this style for games like Diablo over these dips into the cartoonishness. But for me this sometimes is a bit too consistent, which was especially noticeable in the choice of clothing, which I sometimes find really pale and boring, but also for the environment. I just would have liked here and there a blooming meadow or a magical grove with some wild animals maybe. I mean, just because demons are destroying the world, life does not stop to exist in all places. It just would have been nice to have something that breaks the permanently unsaturated look of the game and its destroyed environments, and that just brings some more visual variety to it. But despite this nitpick on my part, I am a fan of the presentation, and that is clearly the highlight of the game. And from the visuals of the game, let's make a transition to the visuals of our character and dive into the gameplay part of this review. Unlike the general graphics of the game, the character editor is not a highlight. The options are very limited, and this is especially noticeable because only a year prior, the same company launched a mobile game for the same franchise whose character editor wipes the floor with that of Diablo 4. We have only 4 faces per class and gender, no slider to fine-tune them in any way. We have a dozen hairstyles, a rather very limited selection of hair and eye colors. But hey, at least there is a lot of jewelry and some tattoos, to which can even add new ones if you're just willing to pay a slim obolus of at least $20 by buying one of the really cheap, high-quality skin sets in the store, which were definitely not cut from the game. Sure. But yeah, apart from that, we also can change most of our appearance afterwards. In our wardrobe, we have only options for the face paint, jewelry and tattoos. But we have no options for our hair or eyes or the colors of those. So if you want to change any of that, have fun replacing your whole frickin' character. But hey, maybe we get Fantasia rebirth flasks in the future, Wouldn't that be great? No chance Blizzard would just create that kind of problem to sell a solution afterwards. Nah, they wouldn't do that, right? As for the class selection, we can choose between Adipositas, Anorexia, the I'm 100% naturals, the skimpy ones, and Mummy? Ow! And rogues. Rogues exist too. Each class feels indeed special, coming with their own style, clothing and gameplay, including their class-specific gimmicks. Whether you prefer classes with a fixed look and set skill trees or customizable bodies and faces with a completely open skill system is up to you. Personally, I'm starting to find fixed classes a bit outdated these days, unless you implement it a little bit like Final Fantasy XIV. Because often it just seems like an artificial stretching of game time when you have to level up multiple characters into the endgame instead of just one that can either freely switch between classes or can be built however you want. The game isn't particularly well balanced anyway, and as mentioned, the classes don't have different personalities within the story, unlike in Diablo 3. And it's all about the fun of hack and slashing through hordes of enemies anyway, so what's the point of keeping things so restricted? But as I said, these are just my personal thoughts on that matter. So let's dip briefly into the feeling with the controller for a second. I switched after the first 2 hours, I think, to the controllers and used it almost exclusively because it's just more relaxed to play this way. And I have to say it works pretty well most of the time. The only problem is that the controls are not precise, so you often can't hit the enemies you want with ranged attacks, and you can't cycle through enemies or loot on the ground. Ergo, if an enemy or another item are in your way, you have to deal with them first until you get to the loot you want. I hope Blizzard will improve this in the future. I mean, just put it on the right stick and we will be fine. So let's talk about the core gameplay. And I already touched on that in the graphics section. The core gameplay of Diablo 4 is awesome. Top tier. It just feels good. With everything I am going to say in this review, you have to always keep in mind that it is this very core gameplay that carries this game. It may not be a lost ark in terms of the oomph and animations and combo type of gameplay, but that's not what Diablo 4 wants to be anyway, and for a fairly simple casual hack and slash combat system, Diablo 4 currently offers the best combat feel that you can get on the market. But all in all, Diablo 4 is a very casual focused game, and that also shows in the gameplay. With only 6 active abilities and relatively easy rotations, many classes are relatively brain dead to play. Even my rogue, who is considered relatively active with the Twisting Blades build, feels really chill once the muscle memory is in place, and with my barb that I'm currently leveling up, it's even simpler. Though I really miss the dash from my rogue. So it usually comes down to spamming one core skill and maybe your ultimate, while the other 4 skills are just there for utility, defense purposes, or to boost the damage spells further. But that also means that the active part of the fighting is very limited and might become boring for some in basically no time. And that's sadly the case for all classes. Speaking of which, the classes offer fun-wise a very unbalanced experience over the course of the game. Some classes are a pain in the ass to play in the campaign, but slowly begin to thrive after level 50. Other classes are fun to play until the end game, but then kind of fall off after that unless you go for very optimized builds. Playing a druid, for example, is like telling a new player in an MMO that the game gets good after 100 hours. That's just complete crap, and I hope they turn a few screws here and there to make the gameplay over the entire game and all classes a little bit more balanced. One specific problem I have with my rogue though was that it kind of felt like 2.5 classes slammed into one without having correspondingly more options in the skill tree. Hybrid builds are almost non-existent, so you always end up having to decide whether you want to play with bows or with blades. So I often thought that my rogue didn't really felt complete in its gameplay. On the other hand, I didn't understand at all why this class uses traps when blades and bows are absolutely enough to fill the skill tree with. The poison trap could have just easily been something like a vial thrown on the ground, and the death trap animation looks more like a blade storm than a trap anyway. And because of the aforementioned points, I kind of get the feeling that they didn't really thought the class through and wanted too much at once, resulting in exactly the opposite. And that's a feeling I don't get with my Barbarian or Sorcerer that way. No matter what I'm skilling, I'm still a Barbarian or Sorcerer, and all the abilities somehow harmonize with the class fantasy. So, I'm very curious. Tell me, all you rogues out there, is it just me, or did you felt kind of the same way? Another point that could limit one's class fantasy are systems like weapon-specific effects. Each type of weapon has a specific, unique modifier. For example, crossbows do more damage to vulnerable enemies, bows do more damage to enemies at a distance, daggers at a close range, and swords always do more critical damage. Besides the often marginal differences in attack speed, these modifiers are the factor that can have a massive impact on the effectiveness of a build, especially when you add in extra effects like weapon mastery. But this also means that some weapon types are inherently better than others. Let's take the example of bows again. For various reasons, the crossbow is a better choice for 95% of rogue builds. So even if you find it visually horrible, like me, and would rather run around with a bow, in a game like Diablo you don't want to sacrifice a 2-digit percentage of your damage just for the visuals. Let's be real here. Who was the idiot that gave crossbows a recoil? What's wrong with you? But the same problem also occurs for other weapons and builds. What is even the class gimmick of the Barbarian, for example? And I simply don't understand why it needs this system at all, or why in response to that they haven't at least made the transmog system a little less restrictive so that you can transmog a weapon to any other weapon in the same slot that a class can use. So bows, for example, can be turned into crossbows and daggers into swords and vice versa. And I'm sure classes like the barbs and druids would be very happy about that too. So let's talk even more about the classes and get into the aspects and the Paragon board. Both are systems that I generally like the concept of, because they soften up the randomness factor for a lot of the game's item effects and turn the late game character progress into a more linear experience with a few power spikes in between. So let's start with the aspects, and we can't talk about them without also talking about our skill tree or skill branch, depending on who you ask. The system behind aspects is relatively simple. If you find a legendary item, you can extract their special item effect and get an aspect that you can later use to imprint this exact item effect onto another item whose stats and level might suit your needs better. That makes it much more comfortable to get a build together later on, instead of having to grind things over and over again until we find an item that gives us as well the needed core stats, but also the correct item effect. And that system gets even more comfortable when we look at the aspect codex. That thing is a collection of all the aspects that we unlock by finishing the dungeons in the open world. Here is no extraction needed, and after unlocking them they are always available to us. That doesn't cover all item effects though, but usually gives you a solid base to build upon. My personal main problem with aspects, however, is that I got the feeling that they often don't add something to a skill, but complete the skill in the first place. Because many attacks in the game without the aspect just feel incredibly bad. In general, I had a permanent feeling here that many skill-changing aspects actually belong in the skill tree as skill variations. Instead of the aspect of Twisted Blade, you could have given the skill 2 or 3 variations that change it in its nature. For example, again twisting blades. Let's say variation A, the twisting blades becomes some form of a hammer dean, so to speak. So whenever you cast it, you just get the circling blades around you that just expand a little bit over time. Variation B could be twisting blades works like throwing knives, so you place them in the cone-shaped area in front of you until they come back and maybe pull enemies slightly with them. And in variation C you could just give the basic skill the additional effect of stealth, what allows you to automatically move through enemies after using it. Then every enemy you touch gets marked, and when the blades come back to you, they go through each of those marked enemies. Or maybe more simpler for the Whirlwind Barbarian, one skill variation that makes the Whirlwind attack just faster and faster over time, one variation that changes it into a single powerful slash with a wider range maybe, and the third variation could be some form of a vacuum that pulls enemies to you while you're whirlwinding around. That kind of skill variations in a skill tree would have been 1,000 times more interesting for builds than something like 0.1 second cooldown reduction per enemy hit or doing more damage after 2 seconds of spinning. That kind of little side effects could have been aspects for all I care, because that just further refines the playstyle that you've chosen. But comparing that to Diablo 3, it's like they cut out the interesting skill runes and part of the core skills to turn them into more grind and unnecessary hassle, because now you have to get those things first and then you have to swap half your equipment every time just to try a different build. And that can be incredibly frustrating for some classes when some uniques are necessary for the builds that you want to try. For example, the Tempest Roar helmet for the Druid Stormwolf build. Even purely in terms of just the sheer amount of skills and thus interesting builds, it is a step backwards from Diablo 3, which is even considered very simplistic itself. In Diablo 4, a simple skill like Strafe would basically be a skill that just shoots randomly in one direction, until you find its aspect that turns it into this omnidirectional attack. How do I know that? Well, because that's already the case for a bunch of skills in the game. And the skill tree that we currently have is only okay-ish again. Simple enough to understand, and it has a few options to experiment a little. Currently it seems like each class has about 2 to 4 builds that are still efficient and viable in the later game, but very often share half of all used skills. In that regard, the game shoots itself in the foot here with the design around core skills that very clearly show you what preferred playstyles and synergies they have. It feels pretty much like paint by numbers sometimes. You can paint a field in a different color, of course, but it's probably going to look like crap. And the same is the case in Diablo 4. Find out which skills, paragon perks and aspects synergize with each other, and then you have your choice of builds, where a few of them will stick out as the most smooth and efficient ones. And then, well, the look of the skill tree itself is just dog shit too. It has an impractical design and uses way more space than it has to, what results in a lot of unnecessary scrolling whenever you move through it. So overall, Diablo 4 kinda has managed to complicate Diablo 3's skill system, while it also reduced the possible variety of builds and the amount of different skills in general. And I just have to wonder how and why. What now brings us also to the Paragon board, which is basically the secondary skill tree after you hit level 50. Because when that happens, your XP bar splits into 4 pieces and every piece gives you 1 Paragon point that you then can spend on the Paragon board. I won't go into too much detail here how that works, but after digging into it you will find out that most nodes of the board consists of just additional stats, and that the things you want are the special nodes that are distributed over all available boards. So suddenly these big boards turn again into a very linear paint by numbers system. That's not a problem to me, and I still think it provides a good enough power progression for your character if there weren't this particular little issue. Because if you want to respec and your new build can't use your current Paragon setup, you have to remove every single node in these boards one after another yourself. And I have no idea how someone could have played the game in any form of quality assurance and didn't brought up the idea of a reset the whole board button, like the skill tree has too. This is just so annoying, and together with the things that I've mentioned about the aspects, it makes you just not want to change your builds most of the time. Coming from our skills to the poor souls that get hit by them. The enemies and monsters of this game. The design is mostly great, the animations are great too, and they are varied enough for the core game, even when I really hope that there will be more in future seasons. What kinda bugs me though is the amount of enemies that can either stun you or that explode. Especially when the screen is full of damage numbers and enemies that body block you Post-death explosions are just a frustrating mechanic. The same goes for stuns. In some dungeons, especially in higher levels, you are forced to use at least one ability with Unstoppable, because otherwise you will be frozen or stunned every few seconds, resulting just in your death. According to those who have already reached level 100, the entire difficulty of the endgame consists only of crowd control and being two-shotted by random mobs like those corpse archers. I can't say anything about it from first-hand experience, but that doesn't sound too great. So I think it would be nice if at least our normal dodge could get us out of such situations, because it's just frustrating to die by getting stunned and without being able to do anything against it. I mean, there are more effects for elites though, but most of them feel either irrelevant or just go under in the midst of enemy hordes, what is sometimes a little problem if they do a shitload of damage to you. So I don't think anything about the level 100 experience will matter to 99% of the player base anyway within the next few weeks or even months, but I hope that is also something they keep an eye on in the future. That's the least they can do after the unpaid level 100 beta testers did the grind and provided that kind of feedback to them. Next, let's make a cut here and move on to the progression through the game, starting with the campaign. And here Diablo 4 straight up trips over its own leg, because for some reason they thought it was a good idea to hide many features of the game behind story progression. Let's just take the example of our Hotehu, our mount. Very prominent in the trailers, but we only unlock it shortly after about half of the game. Until then we are forced to move on foot, which is an absolute pain in the ass, especially for immobile classes. And that's kind of strange, since our first visit in a town leads us straight to the horse stable. It seems like they originally planned to give us our mount at this point in the game, but then realized that it would shorten the duration of the first story run by several hours, so horse be gone. As someone who is currently replaying the story with a second character, I can tell you that it is so much more enjoyable with a horse. But this is not only true for horses. Also important aspects for builds are partially inaccessible unless you progress in the story, as well as all endgame events and the battle pass later on. I don't understand why these aren't unlocked bit by bit in the story, instead of throwing it at us in one sweep after the story ends. Because for a second character who skips the story, the enemies scale down too, no matter if we play on level 50 or level 15. But I guess that would collide with the next problem, because Diablo 4 wants you to rush through the story before you do anything else. And that's because you hit a soft cap after reaching level 50. Because on the world tiers 1 and 2, enemies only scale to level 50 and give significantly less experience as your level increases. But world level 3 only unlocks after completing the story. So if you do a lot of side stuff and let's say reach level 50 in the middle of Act 3, you're kind of forced to focus on the story, because otherwise you're going to be stuck with your level at some point, where I think that might frustrate some people to an extent where they just stop playing the game. So if you want to dodge as much annoyance and frustration as possible, do first the main story with maybe a few side activities here and there, because that's just enough to keep a level high enough. Then get to level 50 and into world tier 3. And then do endgame stuff or the side quests. Oh, and before you do any dungeons, you should maybe first see if there aren't any side quests nearby that lead you in there anyway, because otherwise you have to run through them twice. Overall, this whole structure kills completely the appeal and meaning of an open world for me. It's almost like they developed two kinds of games and then mashed them together. And I think it's sad, because there is no reason to have these mentioned issues. Because the incompatibilities should have been obvious already in the concept stage of the game's development. It should have been possible to structure the game and its story in a way that the endgame activities get available over the course of the story, and that world tiers are just some form of difficulty levels without any kind of restrictions or level caps. That way everybody could just play the game the way they want, without having to worry to explore the open world and do side stuff and then just get punished for literally just playing the content the game is offering you at this stage. Another thing that might bug people is the aforementioned level scaling. Everything scales to your level, so you never really feel like you're getting much stronger. And actually the game doesn't do a very good job of showing you that you're progressing in any other way. Usually games that have level scaling have side systems that you're progressing through and that make you keep playing the game. But the only side progress you have in Diablo 4 is crafting better healing potions. Otherwise you have nothing really. I would have liked to have something maybe like a city or maybe a base for the Overrated, which you can gradually rebuild to have a constant goal in front of the nose in the game and the end game. We even gather a shit ton of materials in Diablo 4. But the way it is at the moment, all the materials that you find seem almost worthless until you want to min-max your build at some point in the end game and then start to upgrade your items. They have no other use than that. And that brings us to the progress balance. Since every enemy scales with you 1-to-1, this opens up the problem, as in other games of this type, that leveling gets practically punished if your gear is a few levels behind. And the difference in the effectiveness of equipment when it's not up to date is very much noticeable and leads to a very inconsistent leveling difficulty through the campaign, but also in some capacities in the endgame. And that is only amplified by the fact that the numerical inflation in Diablo 4 is pretty massive. We start with damage values in the lowest double digits and then do 2000 damage per attack when we hit level 50. The same goes for the value of gold and of course the base stats of our enemies, which in the late endgame also leads to the problem that respeccing isn't that cool because you have to have all the items of the new build at the level of your current build to even take on the enemies in the open world without getting blasted by them. Here again, world tiers as a more general difficulty level would have been a much better solution in my opinion, and they absolutely have to overhaul the system at least a little bit. So let's talk about the open world of Diablo 4. Besides the fact that our motivation to explore it in the campaign is absolutely sabotaged by the progress restrictions of the story and the world tiers, it also has other problems. For one, it's just really big, and that naturally leads to a lot of moving around. Because every activity in Diablo 4 can be found somewhere on the map in the endgame, you spend a lot of time traveling back and forth between points, which is only amplified by collectibles like the little statues. And while you do that, you will notice very quickly how little there actually is to discover. The open world events repeat themselves very quickly. And that's not just because they always appear at the same point and give you the exact same task. Also, what you have to do in them across the board is very similar. Survive X waves of enemies, protect the 3 travelers, stay inside a circle while monsters attack you or the NPC. All of them are completely stationary, and after a dozen of these at most, you've seen them basically all. Why the game doesn't have random encounters and events instead of that is just a mystery to me. I mean, that's a feature that exists for at least a decade now in many other games. But it doesn't even stop here, because the same goes for the 115 dungeons in the game. After a very short time, you will see nothing new in them. The levels are the same, the enemies are the same, the tasks are the same. That literally could have been just 24 dungeons in summary, and it wouldn't have changed anything for your experience, except for the system around the aspect codex. But for that system, you could have just instead made it that you simply add and increase the stats of the aspects that you're extracting. Means if a player finds a new item effect, they can just add it to the codex, and if you find the same item effect but in better later on, you can just upgrade that codex entry. So people won't hunt for just good aspects, but they will hunt for the best rolls on them. A little like the system in The Division 2. But now the question is, what's the point of doing all these things on the map? The overarching goal here are the renown rewards, which you get for gathering enough renown points that are rewarded for doing things in each of the 5 regions, like uncovering the map, do side quests, finish dungeons, find waypoints, liberate strongholds, and click on all the 160 Lilith statues. By the way, why you can't just buy maps for the statues from a trader in the game is beyond me. Everyone knows that 99% of the players at some point will just open their browser and work through the statues that way. Why not just give them the option to display these symbols in the game, when even the markers for the statues exist once you've found them? The renown rewards are mostly just new skill points, paragon points, or an increased amount of potions. And besides the itch to get all those bars filled up, that's the only reason to do them at all. No new cosmetics for you, the zones or cities in them don't change either, or reward you with zone-specific quest lines or things like that. You just get more bigger numbers here again. And then you get to the point where you start your second character, press skip story and find out that 95% of the map has been reset, including the fog of war. And you just think to yourself,
oh shit, here we go again.
But stop, don't worry, most of it is really just visual nature. All the stats of the Lilith statues, for example, the unlocked aspects and the skill and paragon points of the renown rewards are all shared account-wide with all characters. The game doesn't really tell you that, but that's how it is. So the only thing you are supposed to do again with each character is to rediscover the map, find the waypoints, wipe out strongholds, and if you care, go again for the area completions. It will then only reward you with embarrassing amounts of XP and gold. It has to be said that this adds absolutely nothing positive to the game, aside from stretching the game time again for new characters if you just want to get into the endgame with them and maybe try out some builds. And also this becomes a problem once the seasons start, because new season characters are not going to carry over anything aside from the stats of the statues. As far as I know, at this point in time at least. Another part of progress in a hack and slash is the looting and leveling. Besides the gems, which are a pain in the ass and take way too much space from your inventory, the looting feels relatively good to me. I think Diablo 4 hits a good spot here for the amount of loot that you get. At some point you do question though how rare or even legendary items can be when they drop by the dozens in dungeons. I for sure would have liked more rarity levels because it kinda devalues items for me if I hit the end game and the only things you get are rares, legendaries and uniques. This also limits Blizzard's possibilities to add new types of items that feel valuable again. Just having new prefixes a la sacred or ancient just doesn't do it for me if it's still the same frickin' item that drops. And while we are on the subject of endgame, that's okay in itself and has some interesting approaches, but even that wasn't spared by a bunch of issues. So let's get through all things you can do here one by one and start with the new activities that unlock after level 50. The moment we finish the story, we get access to the Tree of Whispers. Here you will get periodically new icons and zones that mark activities that reward you with points, and if you get 10 of them, you can go back to the tree, get a loot cache, and repeat. The idea behind this is probably to make people revisit all parts of the map again, but they don't feel very rewarding for the amount of time you have to spend in them. I basically only do them if a dungeon is marked where I still need the aspect from for my codex, or at the site in PvP zones to farm the currency there, but that's basically it. The Tree of Whisper feels like a very raw system and is probably just there to be part of weekly quests for the seasons. At this point we can also briefly talk about the PvP. That sucks, because classes aren't balanced well and player strength isn't equalized, which means if you encounter another player at all, what is rarely the case, it usually ends up with you both just parting ways to not steal the currency from each other, or that you get one shot at the extraction point by a level 19 no-life druid or barb, which sometimes basically level gates those zones until you reach the maximum level of 100. And even then, the problem remains that some classes are just much better suited for PvP than others without them having to change their build. So that mode also doesn't feel particularly great in Diablo 4. The next thing we have are Hell Tides. That's when zones get red for a while and where you have to farm a currency to spend on random chests that stand around the area. Like farming stuff and opening chests isn't what the whole rest of the game is already about. And it's kinda sad. They actually could have been an interesting experience. Imagine demon hordes coming through portals, raiding nearby towns, and we have to defend these towns, push those ugly demons back, and in the end slap the boss that summoned them. And if we don't do that, new strongholds pop up that we have to defeat again to gain access to a new waypoint. But nope, how they are now, it's just another thing you can do, the exact same in what you're already doing everywhere else too. Besides a specific crafting material that you only get in Helltides, I had no big incentive to participate in them at all if there were no side quests in the areas that I wanted to do anyway. And from one generic and useless activity to another, let's get to the Nightmare Dungeons. Yes, hold your breath. Nightmare Dungeons are basically the Diablo 4 equivalent of Rifts, but instead of having procedural generated levels and monsters, the Nightmare Dungeons happen in 24 of the 115 dungeons that we already know, and you can't teleport to them instantly. Sounds exciting, I know. So how do they work? Basically you can find or craft items that activate one of those 24 Nightmare Dungeons in a specific tier. Higher tier means higher enemy levels and more glyph XP. What are glyphs, you might ask? They are practically just part of the Paragon board that you can put into one of those sockets to get specific effects and buffs. And those can be leveled up to increase those effects. And you do that by finishing Nightmare Dungeons. Interact with one of those shrines that pop up after you are done with the last task and choose the glyph that you want to level up. But because the glyphs are just part of the paint by numbers Paragon board, it usually comes down to use and level just a handful of actually useful glyphs, and that's it. Beyond that, there is no reason to do Nightmare Dungeons, because the enemies on a higher level barely give you more leveling XP than other easier mobs on your own level, and they don't even drop better items. No matter if the mobs are 20 levels above your character, it simply doesn't feel really worth to do. And then there are world bosses and legion events. Those pop up at set times and want to be tackled in groups. So you have to find the symbol on the map, because the game barely tells you that they happen from itself when the timer runs up, and you slap whatever pops up in these areas. None of the 3 world bosses felt particularly difficult or complex to beat, and there are no mechanics around them where it matters that we play in a group. They just have a big ass life bar. And it didn't really help my excitement for them that they already revealed Ashava in the last act of the story, where we have to slap her solo. So tell me, why exactly was the game always online again? And the Legion events are basically just more monster slashing. There's not much more I could tell you about them. And on top of that, the leveling of your character gets relatively slow after level 50. And slows down even more after level 70. And looking at the current endgame the game has to offer, I find it hard to believe that many players will enjoy doing the same thing over and over again for dozens of hours just to slowly creep towards level 100, but that is currently the only thing the game really offers in terms of reward and progress. Imagine big quote marks on these two words. Because talking about rewards, that's in my opinion one of the biggest problems with Diablo 4's endgame. I mentioned already the lack of meta progression or horizontal progress in the game. But also just in terms of rewards, the game offers just a bare bones and bad experience. Considering that Diablo 4's PR liked to mention that it should go more into the direction of an MMO, there is really little MMO endgame here, especially in terms of collecting and things like fashion, which in most MMORPGs and even in Souls games, for example, is practically the end game for many players. And outside of the store, there are really few cosmetics worth to mention. There are no things like pets to collect, and besides a bunch of completely random drops for our mounts in PvE areas, a good chunk of that is just hidden behind the game's PvP currency. And I doubt that many that just want to unlock and collect stuff care about PvP at all. A problem is also that we have nothing to track things, so we don't even know what there theoretically is to unlock and collect. And it's weird because World of Warcraft systems for that are pretty good, so they could have just copied them. Not even the grayed out icons in the transmog screen tell you what styles you are missing and where we can get them from. Besides, of course, from the store. So that's not really how you provide some long-term goals for players. Area completion, dungeons, achievements, going for higher nightmare dungeons, participating in Hell Tides and Tree of Whisper missions. None of them have any overarching rewards for you. You don't even get more than a few stats for clicking all of the 160 Lilith statues. Like, what the fuck? When even collecting the Mokoko seeds in Lost Ark feels more rewarding to you, then there is something really wrong here. And the only explanation that I have for this is simply that you are basically not supposed to do much endgame outside of the seasons. And much more important, outside of the battle passes. And for all those who are not complete suckers for increasing numbers or for pure min-maxing, there's hardly any incentive to play the game after a few hours of endgame at all. So what's left is really just leveling, collecting Paragon points, working through the game world, and hunting for god rolls for your own builds, if these are things you care about. The thing I want to say about the game's endgame is simply that most reviews that I've seen about the game are from people that already hit level 100 and seem to be that exact type of player. But the point is, nobody gives a shit about level 100. Most people will simply stop playing with maybe level 60 when they realize that there's nothing worth for them to do anymore. Nothing worth to strive for, except some stupid leveling in a game that either way scales with you. Titles like Review after hundreds of hours. Come on, shut the fuck up. You guys are completely out of touch with the average player this game is made for. A lot of people will quit before they even reach their first 100 hours, and they might be lucky if they have so much to do in real life that they only get to this point around the time Season 1 starts. And see, according to Wowhead, the vast majority of players haven't even finished the campaign yet. So what does this tell you about the game's main audience? So why do you think Season 1 starts just a month after the release? What does this info tell you about the game's main audience? They are not people that will strive for level 100. Another thing that I wanted to mention in this game was the UI. In general, it's okay, but the game offers almost no possibility to customize it. For example, you can't display bars above or below your character, which would help tremendously with the energy management for some classes. You also have to ask yourself in many other places why basic functions are simply missing. There are no loot filters that allow you to filter for certain item effects or stats, which might then show you a small icon on the item, so you don't have to hover through the entire inventory every time in your search for something useful to you. There's also no auto-sort function in the inventory, and that gems that you find take up an absurd amount of space in your inventory is just ridiculous. Why isn't there an extra bag for them, or why are they not just included in the material list? Also, there's no search function in the chest or any way to sort the extracted aspects in a meaningful way, or loadout slots to easily switch through different builds, or something like an overlay map, like, hello? And as mentioned, something like preview images and a VRAM indicator in the graphic settings are missing too, and come on, basic functions. Guys, I always thought Blizzard's reputation is to take things that run well in other games and make them better and more casual friendly in their own games. So what changed over the past few years here? Call me nitpicky, but we are talking about a AAA developer that still wants $70 for their game minimum, and then it seems like half of all the systems in the game haven't been thought through properly and assumes that players will be satisfied by doing the same repetitive shit over and over again for basically nothing. Pardon, but where the hell did the budget for the game go? Did 80% of it go to marketing and Megan Fox clips? Just compare Diablo 4's core content to games like A Witcher 3, God of War, Red Dead Redemption 2. Any Bethesda game or nearly any other game whose core content isn't just dull, make numbers go up. Why doesn't an Activision Blizzard manage to make more out of the formula of a Diablo in 2023 and even take steps backwards in some regards compared to its predecessor? At the current stage, this is not a $70 game, and looking at the big picture seems pretty half-finished and bare bones. We're being sold half of what the game should have been at full price here, if you ask me, and I have doubts that Diablo 4 was originally really planned for this year. Everything I'm looking at here is a game that was designed around monetization. I mean, just look at it. The launch got monetized. Early access for $20. The story's ending is basically made to be monetized. Cliffhanger to sell new expansions. Look at the endgame. In my opinion, it's pretty boring and dull. Hey, come on, it doesn't have to be great because people will play it just for the battle pass rewards in the seasons anyway. And then you have the unsatisfying reward structure and the lack of cosmetics. Yeah, get your good looking skins in the shop, my bro. And is that something we should just accept like that? With that, let's briefly get to the bugs, of which there were pleasantly few for me. Here and there a roof that didn't become transparent or an NPC that got stuck in one spot. One slay all enemies dungeon bugged out for me because a treasure goblin spawned behind the wall thingy, and then I had another spawn bug with a bunch of enemies in a town area, so I couldn't attack them and they couldn't attack me. But that's about it for my experience with bugs in this game. It seems to be a little different for aspects though, because at this point we probably didn't had a single week since launch where Blizz didn't disable some aspects of sorts, due to them not working perfectly fine and players found ways to exploit them. I think that's annoying AF, especially because that punishes all players until they fix the aspects, but that's generally something you can work through as a player, if the game would actually tell you that your aspects don't work at the moment. What is not really the case. But in general, more problematic is the always online part of the game. Of course, it has the problem that you can't play at all when the servers are down, but it also led to massive stability problems, be it rubber banding or freezes whenever other players load in. It would also have been nice if Blizzard had managed to put out server messages for maintenance things, so that you're not in the middle of a hardcore nightmare dungeon when you get kicked out of the game. And don't even get me started on the people in regions of the world that just don't have 100% stable internet connections. The online part of Diablo 4 at this point at least is so irrelevant, and for example any of the world events would also work with set offline times. So this time always online should have been, in my opinion, a feature that's completely optional. But yeah, Blizzard of course wants to keep the shared world so that players can show off their battle pass and store skins in towns, or while they are waiting for world bosses later on, like for example in the lobbies in Call of Duty World War II or Fortnite. Or why do you think the shared world really exists? Well, at least there are no loot boxes that players have to open in front of other players. Well, not yet at least, I mean. After all, items that work as random boxes already exist in the game. So who knows what the future holds for us, right? And what is also not quite round is the performance of the game. I experienced stutters and even longer freezes in random intervals, and some players seem to have been complaining about memory leaks since the first beta. In general, I'm surprised that a game from the bird's eye view can have such problems as long as it has been optimized halfway properly on PC. These problems are also kinda random. Sometimes they happen in the open world, sometimes in cities, sometimes when you're just using your inventory or map. However, if we take a closer look, we can see that the game indeed has problems with its VRAM usage. Despite switching to other areas, my VRAM just kept filling up until it eventually capped at 7900 to 8100 megabyte, and then it started to juggle what is there, probably because that's when the files were thrown on the normal RAM instead of the VRAM. And the same thing happens on all settings, by the way. Just a little slower, the lower you go with the texture settings. Seen here, for example, on medium, and let's be honest, on medium, you sometimes really don't want to look at the game. Even a technically very questionable game like Warzone, which in my opinion can easily keep up with Diablo 4 visually, doesn't have these problems and just eats up around 4500 megabyte of VRAM on highest settings. Here are just a few visual comparisons. And Warzone is made with the CryEngine that isn't even supposed to work for ARPGs. Made by a developer that failed over the past years to fix really big bugs in the game, and they are seemingly still able to provide a better optimized game than Blizzard with Diablo 4. As mentioned, this kind of problem has been known since the first beta and happens regardless of the GPU and no matter which manufacturer that one is from. Which more or less rules out a driver problem, so to speak. And yeah, I mean, it's simply has not been fixed since these first betas? Well, as long as you have the resources to hotfix the store within a few hours, everything seems to be fine. Am I right, Blizzard? Also, it's kinda hard to know if these freezes and rubber banding that I've mentioned in the Always Online part, it actually came from any connection issues or if they are also the result of the VRAM issues. So if a new player loads in, the game lags out because of that and stops transferring data or piles up data packages from the game's servers and then has to sync stuff up again when it continues to run smooth, so your client starts to rubber band stuff around. And I'm very curious. The people that have more experience and knowledge of these technical things are very welcome to correct me and explain things further here, and I will thank you in advance. But overall, the technical state of Diablo 4 is also more a mixed bag, despite that it runs most of the time relatively smooth. And then you might have noticed in this review, I often focus on the cosmetic items and collecting things or some form of meta progression, because that is what I and many others like to play games for. I will do another video in the future about the different types of players, but the TLDR is basically that every player has different motivations to play games for. Some like to explore worlds, some like to collect things, some are looking for competition with other players, those are usually playing PvP. Some search simply social contact in, for example, guilds, some enjoy theory crafting, some are looking for engaging stories in games, and so on. And corporate overlords look for ways to monetize these kind of interests. For example, I like good lore, I like good stories, I like a living world, I like unlocking stuff and working towards things that visually change something about me or the world. I am not playing games for any competition, but purely casually for myself. I am the type of player that just salvages a god roll in Diablo 4 if I don't have the transmog yet. That's me. And Diablo 4 is a game that monetizes player like me to the bone. Because what we get in the game is disappointing and we can already see the qualitative gap between skins in the game and those skins in the shop. Especially as a rogue, this hit me pretty hard because I find the outfits of this class among the most boring. Either you have damaged armor parts or a pair of rags or a mix of both. I know the game wants to be dark and gritty, but I really don't need these Assassin's Creed outfits bought on Wish. Stylistically, the Demon Hunter from the predecessor simply feels much more interesting. Other classes have it a little bit better, but even here a good quarter of the clothes are just duplicates with slight changes or clothes where parts of the assets have been reused. It's relatively disappointing what is in the game right now. And here comes the point that I actually want to make. Selling cosmetic items also has the exact same problem as pay to win or things like pay to convenience have. It creates the incentive for developers to make things in the game worse so you can monetize on these solutions. I personally would have had zero issues with pay to win, for example. What's the point of spending money so you don't have to play the game? What do I care about the numbers in Diablo 4? Everything scales with you anyway, so am I stupid? Why would I pay for that? But for many of you, that would have taken the fun out of the game. The feeling of your success, your achievements, the reason to play the game, to hit level 100. And it's basically the same for me with stuff like unlocks and cosmetics. Also, and this may be an insinuation, they were very sparse with sexualized clothing in the game, while on the other hand Blizzard puts Megan Fox half naked in front of the camera to advertise the game. I really expect that in the future you will have to pay good amount of money for more revealing clothing in Diablo 4, as it already is the case with the current Sorcerer skin. Or why do you think, for example, these Inarius wings were only available as a cosmetic for Diablo 3 and not for Diablo 4? I will tell you. In one of the games you can turn these kinds of wings into additional money. But yeah. Each of the items in the store could be a reward. A rare drop from events, a reward for reaching level milestones for each class or for achievements. If you are saying that it doesn't affect you and there is no benefit to buying anything in the shop, you're putting the cart before the horse. The store already has an impact on your game experience automatically in the form of cut content. And yes, if there's a store with dozens of items at release, that's just fucking cut content. and we don't even know what else is being held back to put in the store with Season 1. And the problem is also simply that the store has no reason to exist. Everything is self-financing in Diablo 4. The game for $70, the expansions will also be sold separately, the seasons are financed via Battle Pass, so what justifies the existence of the store in this game? I mean, it's literally just a Warzone store again, only with higher prices and in a $70 full price game. And now this is also the point in which my comment at the very beginning becomes important. Blizzard as a company is dead. There's only Activision Blizzard King left, and we see the same crap in every game of the last years. Call of Duty, Overwatch 2's monetization changes justified with lies, and now we have Diablo 4. In none of those games you get notable cosmetics without spending extra money, and each of these games will continue to try to push the boundaries of what is possible, including pay to win and convenience. And Diablo 4 sets a new standard for what will be normal and acceptable in the future. Because now we have free-to-play monetization in a $70 full-price game, with early access. And everyone seems to be willing to swallow that. No, it's even better. Some creators are already talking unironically about what cool stuff will come into the game's shop in the future. And for real, we really haven't seen what the future will bring. If you extrapolate from the past into the future, it looks more dark and gritty than Diablo could ever be. And yeah, that's it from me on the subject of monetization. And I can only hope that my last few sentences age really bad. But yeah, I think it's reasonable to be pessimistic about that. So for what exactly are we paying $70 here? For a 15-hour story with the writing quality of Transformers, with a bad sub-ending and which on top of that has fewer cinematics than its predecessor from over 10 years ago, for a character editor that even its mobile cousin wipes the floor with, for classes that are a downgrade in terms of personality compared to Diablo 3, for an in-game store that is even more expensive than in the same company's free-to-play games, for having no reason to continue to play after level 50 unless you enjoy pointless level grind or min-maxing, because outside the store there are hardly any unlocks worth mentioning or a good meta progression in the game, for a game that doesn't seem to be technically particularly well optimized for PC, for a game that lacks basic features for its genre and AAA games in general, for a game that I couldn't even play without an internet connection, and where I couldn't do anything should Blizzard decide at some point to just shut down the servers, or to release a free-to-play Diablo 4.2, where they promise us real MMO features before and after the release, and add massive pay-to-convenience monetization only to cancel the MMO plans a few weeks after the transition? They wouldn't do that, right? There is no precedent for something like that in the company's history. Yeah. We're paying $70 for a game that does absolutely nothing particularly well apart from its presentation. So where exactly is the Blizzard quality in Diablo 4 that you should be willing to pay $70 for? Many older or indie games offer more for far less money, without the need to monetize themselves apart from expansions. And when we take a look back at all my points, it gets clear that this is not a game with monetization, but it's basically monetization the developers had to design a game around. Not a single element in this game was made without the thought first of how they can monetize you or your friends. May it be the unfinished story, the lack of rewards, the qualitative difference of cosmetics, the shared world, hell, not even the release itself was done without the thought of upselling via early access. I understand what players like about Diablo 4 and why they have fun. And by God, I don't want to criticize anyone for that. Have fun. That's what games are about. But this game simply doesn't have much to offer, especially in comparison to the genre competition. And I bet on one thing, it will deliberately make you feel worse later on, to sell you something, and you will defend those purchases. Mark my words. If you want to spend money, you have an incredibly wide range of much cheaper games, including Diablo 2 and 3. And if you're really a sucker for min-maxing, Path of Exile is basically a free-to-play game that offers much more depth and complexity for you. And if you're just into awesome combat and aren't completely put off by the Asian look, and even Lost Ark is currently a game that offers significantly more content, horizontal progression, and especially MMO content. And even as a Korean free-to-play game has skins in its store that are cheaper than those in Diablo 4. So what's going on here? Have our standards dropped that low? We are not even in the years where kids have their first consoles and PCs that only grew up with cash grab mobile games. Additional cosmetics used to cost only a fifth of what people seem willing to pay today. And that's a problem, and Diablo 4 is the precedent for stakeholders getting all wet in their panties. Early access and free-to-play monetization in full-price games with mandatory online play. You want to know how games will look like in 2 to 3 years? Exactly like this. So, final conclusion. I'm personally torn between a 3 and a 1. Basically, Diablo 4 is a solid game that many can have a few dozen hours of fun with, no question. If it weren't for the price, the competition, and especially the additional monetization. Because on the other hand, I feel the inner need to tell everyone that the current core game isn't worth the $70 and should definitely not be bought. So, to make it easy for me, I will just make it a 2 and change my usual recommendation sentence a little bit. Diablo 4 is a game I would not recommend to anyone except people that feel mental and physical pain to not play the game. Diablo 4 is a base for a game as a service which should have started with a price of $30 maximum and Season 1. Because you simply don't get more than a basic skeleton here. A visually and tonally appealing one. But also one that is by no means outstanding in terms of narrative, gameplay or content. And with scores that often exceed 90 in the big magazines, Diablo 4 is plain and simply one thing: overrated. So do with that statement what you want. That was my core game review of Diablo 4. I will take another closer look at the service part with the start of Season 1 and give my opinion on that. And since I've been reading the Sin War trilogy for a few days now, I might also do a follow-up video on the game's story, but then with spoilers, of course. So, yeah, my name is TechTrack, but just call me Techie. If the video helped you, then I appreciate a like. If you didn't like it, then feel free to dislike. And if you want to see more reviews and other videos about gaming, you are very welcome to subscribe to my channel. Tell me what you think of the game, what points you agree and disagree on. You can find my streaming platforms and other links in the description, and otherwise I just have to say, as always, have a wonderful morning, day, afternoon, evening or night, and...
See you, chump.